Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're doing a top 10. The topic of the top 10 gimmicks inspired by movies. Basically this is wrestlers who took part or their whole gimmick from a movie. I will put a couple caveats up front. First off, this was recommended by our good friend Bucky749, the American Samurai. Shout out to you, Bucky. Shout out to Jeremy as well. And I'm going to put a couple caveats up front. Some movies have several wrestlers that have taken from them. I'm going to talk about that when I get there. I only chose one gimmick per movie. And also on the flip side, there are some wrestlers that have taken from several movies. So I'm only taking one wrestler per gimmicks, if that makes sense. With that being said, let's jump right into the list. Number 10, Tyler Breeze, borrowing from Zoolander, specifically the character of Derek Zoolander. Tyler Breeze is an extremely gifted wrestler who I don't think ever fairly got his shot on the WWE main roster. When I was watching him in NXT, I thought to myself, this is a guy that's going to be a future star. Could potentially be the next Shawn Michaels. I know that's said about a lot of people. But he really just had that it factor. And he took kind of what Rick Martel did with his model character and made it a little bit different. He made it more like the character of Zoolander. The ridiculousness of it, the passion he poured into it, the amount of effort he made to make this character something special really made it his own thing. You could still tell where the influence came from, kind of like Olivia Rodrigo. If you listen to her music, you could see she's very obviously inspired by Paramore, or if you're not into pop music, Greta Van Fleet, who are very much inspired by Led Zeppelin. You could take inspiration from someone and then change it and make it your own, much like Breeze did here, using that Zoolander character. I thought it was awesome. Our number 9. I did mention I was going to go with one wrestler per movie. This one is kind of a cheat in two ways. First off, I'm going with two wrestlers. Mortis and Glacier, based off the Mortal Kombat movie. So it's a cheat in a way that I'm using two different wrestlers. And I do consider a tag team one thing, so we'll cover that when we get to the tag teams that are on this list. But since their gimmicks were so intertwined with each other, I feel like they're one and the same. I can't say one without the other. And yes, the Mortal Kombat is kind of a cheat because is it based off of the movie or the game? It came out after both, so you could say it took inspiration from both. Glacier is the more obvious homage. He's obviously a homage to Sub-Zero from the Mortal Kombat movie and game. Mortis had more of a reptile vibe, but he wasn't as on the nose as Glacier was, but still had that in him. Rumors were that at the time there was going to be a whole stable of Mortal Kombat wrestlers, but it didn't go into effect because it kind of didn't get over. I think this is one of those things in hindsight where people of that generation, like myself and other fans, look back at this fondly, even though it wasn't looked at as being great at the time. It was kind of crapped all over. It was something they tried. It didn't quite work, but it's so memorable that it had to make this list. A comer from that, our number 8. Bray Wyatt, borrowing heavily from Cape Fear and the Max Cady character played by Robert De Niro. Now, I know a lot of people are going to jump, and before you do, I do know that Dan Spivey did the Waylon Mercy character first, which is also based off of Cape Fear. If you remember in the beginning, I did say we're only going to go with one wrestler per movie. The reason I picked the Bray version is Bray Wyatt was way more successful with it than Dan Spivey was. Now, he's morphed the character since his time, and he's nowhere anything like that Cape Fear character at all. A couple mannerisms he still brings out, but the original Wyatt family and the original character, even down to the way he dressed, had to be heavily influenced by the movie. And I gotta imagine that Dan Spivey, who was a friend of Barry Windham's, had to have been some of the inspiration for this. Much like I said with Tyler Breeze, Wyatt was able to carve this into his own thing. While you could see the inspiration of the movie in there, he also made it different enough that it was his own thing. Awesome character, one of the more popular and polarizing wrestlers of this generation. And if you remember back, his initial gimmick was heavily inspired by a movie. Now going from Bray Wyatt, our number 7, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, borrowing from the movie Walking Tall, specifically the character of Buford Pusser. Now, you may say to me, George, Walking Tall came out in the 2000s. Duggan was wrestling back in the 80s. In case you're not familiar, the movie The Rock made, Walking Tall, is actually a remake of a movie from the early 70s, which both movies are good. The Rock version, the original version, they're both really good. I prefer the original a little more, not saying that the Rock version is bad. I just feel like the original version is a little grittier, not as polished, a little rough around the edges. I enjoy it a little more. If you notice the way that Duggan took a no-nonsense attitude, carried the 2x4, much like Buford Pusser had a stick, it's very similar. Duggan was just your no-nonsense, kick-butt, take-names type guy, much like Sheriff Buford Pusser, which is actually a true story. It's based on a true story. I don't know how much of the movie is actually true or how much is embellished, but there is some truth to it. You can definitely see the inspiration, especially if you haven't seen this movie, go back and watch it. You can see it right away. I knew it right away when I was a kid because I had seen the movie before I seen Duggan wrestle. As soon as I seen him come out with the 2x4, I said, oh, he's doing Walking Tall. Again, he took it and made it his own thing. He didn't stick exactly to the character, which you're going to notice on this list. The wrestlers do put their own twist on it. They just have a little bit of an influence there. For that and how successful Duggan's career is, he had to make this list. Now going from Jim Duggan to our number 6, a wrestler that couldn't be more different than Hacksaw Jim Duggan. Kushida and his Back to the Future homages. Specifically, the Marty McFly character. Everything from naming his finishing move, the hoverboard lock, to the way he dresses, to his entrances. He even had a Doc Brown and Marty McFly entrance at a show at one point. Kushida is heavily influenced by this movie, and rightfully so. It's one of the great movie series of all time. Kushida on this side, it's more of an aesthetic thing than his gimmick, because for the most part, Kushida's been in New Japan Pro Wrestling, where, yeah, they're gimmicks, but it's not as highly relied upon as it is in America. One of the most successful junior heavyweights, if not the most successful junior heavyweight in New Japan history. An absolutely legendary wrestler who's in the middle of his career right now. If he retired now, he would go into what would have to be the New Japan Hall of Fame or a Wrestling Hall of Fame as soon as he retires. I still think he has a lot of years left. He's the first one to tell you that he definitely borrows from the movie. You could see it. Everybody that's seen Back to the Future understands it. I just love this character and I love Kushida. Hence why he made our list. Now going from that, our number 5. The Dudley Family, borrowing heavily from the Hanson brothers from Slapshot. Now the Dudleys that morphed into Bubba Ray and Devon that everybody knows kept some of the original traits of the Dudley clan. However, the original Dudley clan, as thought of and created by Raven in ECW, the Dances with Dudley, Big Dick Dudley, Bubba Ray when he was stuttering, all took heavy influence from the movie Slapshot. And Raven even said this himself. He seen the guys in Slapshot, wanted to make some of his lackeys basically be the Hanson brothers. It wasn't until the Dudley boys, Bubba Ray and Devon, split from the goofiness of the original Dudley clan and became more serious as a tag team that they kind of shed that homage. You would still see they wore the glasses. That's where the glasses come from. They come from Slapshot. They would still carry that through most of their career. In my opinion, the most successful tag team of all time, the greatest tag team of all time. And I thought they were absolutely amazing. Definitely picked a great movie to base themselves off of. And for the most part, every movie or every movie franchise I'm going to reference here is a fantastic movie that I highly suggest you check out, especially if you don't know the references here. This was just a fun thing. Started off as fun, led into one of the great tag teams of all time. I'll go from that, our number 4. From one of the great tag teams of all time to one of the great big men of all time. Kane, borrowing heavily from Halloween, specifically the Michael Myers character. If you watch Kane, especially when he had the mask on, his mannerisms, the way he moved, the way he wrestled, was basically Michael Myers. And there's a reason for that. When they were coming up with the character, Jim Cornette kind of put into Kane's head that you should model yourself after Michael Myers. You should have the motions of him. You should be basically an indestructible machine built just for killing. The original Halloween is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. I absolutely love the movie. Michael Myers, the character, is probably one of my two favorite horror characters of all time, him and Jason Voorhees, which I go back and forth. I like them both a whole lot. You could definitely see where the inspiration came from, especially when you tie that in with, you add the inspiration of The Undertaker. You could see where he added what The Undertaker did to the Michael Myers character to make the Kane character, which I'll say to this day, I don't think the Kane character was meant to last more than 6 months or a year. I think he was meant to be one feud and then go away, and then maybe Glenn Jacobs would be something else. It didn't. He got a 20-year career out of that character, and kudos to him. Kudos to Glenn Jacobs for making such a memorable character and splitting it from The Undertaker, taking that tie away. Yes, there was always the Brothers of Destruction, but he carved out his own niche, and he made himself a legendary, Hall of Fame-worthy career all on his own. Going from that, our number 3. Now, this movie has a ton of wrestlers that took homage from it. The Road Warriors, Hawk and Animal, borrowing heavily from the aesthetics of the Mad Max series, so much so that even one of the movies in the series is called The Road Warriors. Now, this wasn't a specific character that they based their look off of. It was more of a general look that was brought on by the movie. And if you've seen the movies or you've seen the remakes, you'll notice that they have the spike pads, the face paint is used, the mohawks and the reverse mohawk. And the Road Warriors were far from the only wrestlers to do this. The Lord Humongous character is directly ripped out of that movie. There's a character named Lord Humongous in the movie that looks exactly like the Lord Humongous that wrestled. There's also several other characters. You could say Demolition took homage from this based on the way that their gear was set up. That was set up much like the Lord Humongous character. The Powers of Pain, who also kind of were a mirror to the Road Warriors themselves. And you get into the category of how many wrestlers were actually inspired by the Mad Max movies separately from the Road Warriors, and how many wrestlers were inspired by the Road Warriors without directly knowing the movie reference. Much like I said with the Dudley Boys, the Road Warriors, the Legion of Doom, one of the great tag teams of all time. I put them more high on this list because of the influence and the overall character, more ties to the movie than the Dudley Boys did, especially once they became just Bubba Ray and Devon. But I would say in any tag team list that you look at, both the Road Warriors and the Dudley Boys have to be in your top 5, and I would argue they should be 1 and 2 on everybody's list. One of the legendary acts in the history of wrestling. There's a reason why it's called the Road Warrior Pop, because they got that reaction. Just an amazing team, one of the great teams of all time, and obviously one of the great uses of a movie homage. Now, going from that, our number 2, Razor Ramon, borrowing heavily from the movie Scarface and the character Tony Montana. If you're not familiar with Scarface and you don't see the reference just by looking at the two, go watch the movie. Al Pacino's cadence and the way he talks is exactly how Razor Ramon talked. The vignettes were basically shot on the same streets as a lot of the Scarface movie was. The stuff that we tie to Razor Ramon, tie to Scott Hall, even all these years later, the bad guy, Chico, that all comes from Scarface. This was something that Scott Hall himself said he went into Vince McMahon, and Vince had no idea. He'd never seen the movie. He just thought the character was great. This was just such an iconic character for that era of wrestling and all of wrestling. Scott Hall, aka Razor Ramon, one of the biggest legends in wrestling, one of the big disturbers, revolutionaries, influential. There's not a wrestler wrestling today that Scott Hall hasn't influenced in one way or another, whether it be their paycheck, their style, their interviews. The guy is just that transcendent when it comes to professional wrestling. What a great talent, what a great use of that character, and again, making it his own, because just on the surface, you look at Razor Ramon, you don't automatically put the two together until you really think about it. Now, before we get to number 1, We have a thing here called the best of the rest. Basically, it's things that were considered for the list but didn't quite make it. First up, one of my personal favorites, I had to put it on the list just because I love the guy so much. The Blue Meanie, borrowing from the Yellow Submarine movie, the Beatles movie, specifically the Blue Meanies. Again, from the mind of Raven, we have another one of his lackeys in Raven's Nest in ECW. They had an extremely talented wrestler that they didn't know what to do with. And Raven watches the Yellow Submarine movie, comes up with this idea, puts the paint on his face, has him dye his hair blue. We get one of the most memorable characters in the history of ECW in the Blue Meanie. Just a guy who brought joy to wrestling and a general goofiness and willingness to do everything and anything to make himself popular, to make the fans love him, to make the fans go home happy. I absolutely love the Blue Meanie. I'm a huge ECW guy, I've said it a million times, and Meanie has a special place in my heart. One of the genuine nice guys in pro wrestling too. I've had the opportunity to meet him a couple times and he was great every time. I love the Blue Meanie. Hence why he was thought of for the list, but didn't quite make it. Now, last but not least, on the best of the rest, Paul Burchill, borrowing heavily from Pirates of the Caribbean and Jack Sparrow. Probably the least successful of all the gimmicks on this list. However, the most on-the-nose interpretation. I mean, we literally went from Pirates of the Caribbean being one of the biggest movies in the box office to that same year having Paul Burchill changing his character to being a pirate. This was out of place at the time it happened. I mean, we're talking about a silly gimmick in the era where silly gimmicks didn't really work. I can't knock the guy because I do think Paul Burchill was a great wrestler. He seemed to get burdened by a lot of bad gimmicks. This was one of them. But it's still a memorable character, and it's still such a tie to that movie that it kind of works so great together. Now, before we get into our number one, if you think I put something too high, something too low, left someone off the list altogether, put it down here in the comments. With that being said, our number one pro wrestling gimmick inspired by movies, Sting, inspired by The Crow, specifically Eric Draven, famously portrayed by Brandon Lee. This was another thing attributed to the mind of Scott Hall, who also brought us the Razor Ramon Scarface connection. When Sting was looking for a change from what everybody affectionately refers to as Surfer Sting to a more serious character, Scott Hall just kind of said to him, well, why don't you dress like the Crow? Why don't you do the Crow? And it's morphed over the years, it's changed, but the original look of the Crow, the duster, the white and black face paint, that's the Sting character. It was so much in the pop culture lexicon at the time, the Crow movie, that it was unavoidable that someone in wrestling was going to do it. So why not give it to one of the most popular wrestlers of all time? Sting took that, added a lot of mystery, mystique to it, built up to, in my opinion, one of the best build-ups to a match in history. The execution wasn't so great. The match between him and Hogan at Starrcade, to me, had one of the greatest build-ups that I've ever seen in any pro wrestling company anywhere. An absolute legend of the wrestling business. On anybody you talk to's top 10, especially if you're talking about just WCW, he's probably number one if you talk about WCW to anyone. Just a fantastic character. The great thing about it is, many years later, he would even morph that Crow Sting character to what now is affectionately known as the Joker Sting character in TNA. Again, borrowing from The Dark Knight and Heath Ledger's amazing performance as the Joker. But everybody knows, and he did go back to it, the Crow Sting is a Sting that everybody loves. It's the one that everybody looks at as the icon. It's the one that gave us most of the memorable moments in Sting's career. Just a fantastic use of a movie character by a wrestler, by a legendary wrestler who made it all his own. That being said, let's smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. If you made it all the way to the end, let me know you made it to the end. Let me know a movie character or movie that you would like to see brought into the world of wrestling today. Whether it be Jurassic Park, any of the Marvel movies, The Notebook, whatever movie character or movie genre, like Mad Max we see here, wasn't a specific character, you'd like to see interpreted into a wrestling character, let me know down here in the comments. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been another Heel Heat Top 10.